Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. As I do on occasion, I wanted to drop a bonus episode into the feed from Western Civ 2.0. You can get access to this by clicking the link in the show notes, and for a few dollars a month, you can get access to the total backlog of all the episodes that I have. Essentially, Western Civ 2.0 is a reboot of the original podcast. I love ancient and classical history, as you've probably guessed by now. But when I recorded a lot of those episodes many, many moons ago, my audio equipment wasn't as good, and I didn't have a good sense of what I was doing. So I decided to go back and have another crack at it, and really delve into some of the stories that kind of glossed over the first time around. Today's episode is the bonus episode that I recorded on the First Punic War, which I gave very short shrift to in the original feed, but as you'll see here, goes into a lot greater detail as to how the Romans ultimately come out on top over their Carthaginian opponents. So this gives you a sense of what's available. This is episode 63, the First Punic War. Now, if you'd like to try out Western Civ 2.0, you can get a 7-day free trial by clicking the link and following along. Now, of course, while this episode, because it's in the main feed, does have ads, the paid episodes do not. And in fact, if you would just like to access our regular episodes, a regular weekly feed, but without ads, you can get that for $1 a month or $12 a year. As usual, I very much appreciate any and all support that I receive. So then, without further ado, let's take a listen to Western Civ 2.0, episode 63, the First Punic War. Once the Romans and Carthaginians had committed themselves to the aid or aggression toward Syracuse, the die was cast. The First Punic War would be fought on and over Sicily. While certainly the fleet and the army for both sides worked together, most historians I have read break the various campaigns down between the war on land and the war on sea. I, given that I am not a historian and am in no way in a position to question the wisdom of this approach, will do the same. We shall begin with the land war on Sicily. Syracuse provided the Romans with a secure base of operations on the island. While Messana was quickly taken, which was the whole basis for the beginning of the conflict, there is no indication either side attempted negotiations. Carthage saw no reason to negotiate. Its early losses could be easily reversed, and they saw Sicily as theirs. The Romans were upstarts and needed to be pushed back off the island as soon as possible. The Romans, for their part, believed the Carthaginians needed to understand that they had lost, and they had to come to terms favorable to Rome, just like Hero, the tyrant of Syracuse, had done. Plus, it certainly did not hurt that Sicily was rich, and they, the Romans, wanted it. For the next several hundred years, those two factors, in fact, are going to justify quite a lot of conflicts. Carthage immediately went to work raising a mercenary army. Rome responded by dispatching both consuls and 4 legions in 262. Carthage decided to use Agrigenta, about midway along the coast of Sicily on the southern side, as its basis for operations. But the Roman consuls moved quickly, and by the time the commander within the city had a chance to react, 40,000 Roman legionnaires were bearing down upon him. This commander, named Hannibal because, of course, pulled everyone back within the walls, which Romans took as a sign of weakness. It happened to be harvest time, so the consuls sent their men out to forage for food. Hannibal saw the chance and he took it, launching a vigorous sally. The only thing that held back a complete Roman disaster was their camp picket line, which, though badly outnumbered, put up a stout defense. In the end, the Romans were able to regroup and Hannibal suffered major losses. Both sides came away chastened. Hannibal knew that he couldn't afford to keep taking such losses, and the Romans realized they needed to stop underestimating their foe. Now, the easiest way to take a city during the Punic Wars was by surprise or treachery. An attacker might launch a surprise offensive at night and seize key defensive points before the defender knew what was going on. This was all the easier if there happened to be a disaffected group within the city that might aid in the attack. In the Punic Wars, more cities fell by treachery than by any other means. But that wasn't the case here. Agrigentum would not be betrayed, so the Romans would need to resort to their other options: assault or blockade. Assault was the one aspect of ancient warfare most affected by technological advances. It involved the attacker finding a way over, through, or under the defender's fortifications. The simplest method was escalade, when the attacking infantry carried ladders up to the wall and attempted to scale them. But this always involved heavy casualties and was rarely successful unless the walls were virtually devoid of defenders. Mobile siege towers, which dropped a drawbridge onto a rampart and allowed men to cross, while providing covering fire from archers or artillery on top, were essentially an extension of the same basic ladder principle. The main alternative was to create a breach in the walls by battering rams or tunneling underneath to what's called undermine them. But this all required extensive preparation, scientific knowledge, and labor to create siege works, allowing engines such as a battering ram to pass over any defensive ditches and then reach the wall. All the time, the defender would be employing artillery to hinder this activity, countermining to thwart the attacker's tunneling, and launching sallies to burn the siege engines. The ingenuity of both sides was constantly tested, as they struggled to find countermeasures. It was like a constant ping pong or a back and forth. We saw this a lot with Tyre and Alexander the Great. Once the defenders had been breached, then ingenuity and technical skill went out the window, as the assaulting infantry had to storm their way inside. Casualties would still probably be heavy, and failure was a real possibility even then. Such was the massive effort and uncertainty of the outcome that assaults on major cities were not contemplated lightly. Convention decreed that a defender would normally only be permitted on terms to surrender if he did so before the first battering ram touched the wall. If they did not, then the city would be subject to a sack. At this period, the Roman army lacked the technical skill to undertake such a project on a city as large as Agrigentum, with any real prospect of success. Hence, the only choice available to the Romans at Agrigentum was blockade, and they took it. Luckily for the consular armies, Agrigentum was not on the coast, which is a rarity for a Carthaginian city. Without ships, the Romans never could have blockaded the city, but because it was situated on a plateau several miles inland, the Romans were able to construct a series of forts and ditches to effectively hem the city in. Sensing that the situation was quickly becoming dire, Hannibal called for aid after just 5 months. The Carthaginians sent all the troops they had mustered, perhaps as many as 70,000 men, which would have given them a slight advantage over the Romans, at least in terms of numbers. The Carthaginian army quickly cut the Roman supply lines, and the weakened men began to fall sick in their crowded camps. The Carthaginians followed up on this success with a lightning cavalry strike that was also successful. Already in Sicily, the Romans were discovering that their cavalry was just no match for the light Numidian horse of Carthage. And we're going to see that again, but much more decisively in the Second Punic War. The Romans, and then Carthaginians, then started a sort of cat and mouse game, each offering battle in turn only to have the other side decline. Ultimately, forced by desperate messages from Agrigentum that the city was soon to capitulate, the Carthaginians gave in and accepted the Roman offer to fight a pitched battle. Polybius gives few details of this battle, but it seems that the Carthaginian army was deployed in more than one line, with a front line of infantry supported by a second containing more infantry and the elephants. It is possible that the intention was to tire out the Roman infantry, weakening their formation and destroying the impetus of their advance. But this is no more than pure speculation. Presumably, the cavalry was on the wings, and the Romans were in their usual triple axis. After a long struggle, it was the Romans who drove back and routed the Carthaginian first line. As these mercenaries retreated, the panic spread to the reserve formations, and these fled. The Romans captured the Punic camp and most of the elephants. Diodorus claims that the Carthaginian commander, Hanno, lost 3,000 infantry and 200 cavalry killed, and 4,000 men captured, while 8 elephants were killed outright and 33 disabled. But this is included in the total losses of the earlier cavalry battle. That being said, Diodorus also admits that Roman losses in the siege and battle amounted to over 30,000 infantry and 550 cavalry. But this is from an army of 100,000, which he claims the besiegers were able to muster. Both the size of the army and the casualties seem too high, although the latter may well have been substantial. Another historian, Xenarius, provides a different version of the battle in which Hanno hoped to coordinate his attack with a sally by Hannibal's garrison within Agrigentum. But this was thwarted when the Romans learned of the plan and ambushed the main force, while easily defeating the garrison's raid, with the outposts guarding the camp and siege lines. Xenarius implies that the battle began late in the day, and the same thing is claimed by Frontotius, who attributes the consul Postidimus the stratagem of refusing battle and remaining close to the camp, as he had already done for several days. When the Carthaginians decided that the Romans were unwilling to fight and began to withdraw, satisfied that they had demonstrated their better fighting spirit, the Romans suddenly attacked and defeated them. It's just not possible to know how accurate all of these different traditions are. But we can say, and our sources at least agree, that the battle ended in a clear Roman victory. Hanno's use of elephants has often been criticized, given their failure to support the first line. It has been suggested that the Carthaginians at this point were not used to employing elephants and unaware of correct tactics, this being the first recorded instance of their use by a Punic army. However, lacking a more detailed narrative, we cannot be certain what Hanno's battle plan actually was, or if it went wrong, precisely what went wrong. The failure of the different elements in his army to support each other effectively may have been a reflection of its army's composition. Most of these troops were recently raised and had not had much time to maneuver as an army or to become familiar with their commanders. After the loss, Hannibal was able to get the majority of his army out of the city in the dead of night by secretly filling a section of the Roman ditch with earth. The upshot of this, however, was that Agrigentum fell to the Romans. While the campaign had tactically been a success, neither Roman consul was awarded a triumph, suggesting some displeasure with how often and how close to disaster the Romans had frequently come. Still, the Senate now voted to expand the Roman war aim to include the complete ejection of Carthage from Sicily. What had begun as a minor border dispute with Messana was now an all-out war of conquest. The defeat of Hanno outside Agrigentum was one of only 4 massed battles fought on land throughout the 23 years of the First Punic War, which is incredible and a marked contrast with the Second Punic War, where, as we're going to see, pitched battles were by far more common, which I suppose to an extent is what makes the Second Punic War a little bit more interesting. And trust me, I'm very excited to break down each of these battles. Now, 2 of these 4 battles, so half of them, occurred in the relatively brief African campaign of Regulus, and this is something I'm going to get to later. And the only 2 in Sicily, despite the deployment of large number of soldiers there by both sides for much of the war. Now look, part of the reason that we don't have a lot of pitched battles in the First Punic War is just the topography of Sicily. There's a lot of rugged terrain in most of central Sicily, and it just doesn't favor the movements of large armies. With so many good defensive positions, it was difficult for a commander to force a battle on an unwilling adversary. More importantly, the bulk of the island's population lived in the numerous walled cities or in their dependent villages. These were the key to Sicily, and only through controlling these communities could the island be secured. The territories controlled by Syracuse and Carthage had little unity, being composed by a patchwork of these small city-states, most of whom enjoyed almost unfettered local autonomy. From the earliest actions to break the blockade around Messana, the operations of armies were dominated by the need to secure each individual town and city. So it's very much sort of a plodding, almost World War I style warfare that we have going on here. The outcome of a pitched battle was always uncertain, and a defeat might well involve very high casualties and the demoralization of the rest of the army. Even a victory merely left the successful army to pursue its main task of subduing cities more freely, which might not actually be any easier depending upon the nature of that victory. Under normal circumstances, the potential gains were insufficient for both sides to be willing to risk joining battle. It is significant that both the major battles to occur in Sicily were fought outside and for the control of cities. A high proportion of the troops deployed in Sicily were probably dispersed in small garrisons to hold the various cities. As always in siege warfare, the advantage remained with the defender. It was extremely difficult, if not impossible, to keep armies in the field in one location for very long. At the outset of the Punic War, Rome lacked the technical expertise that it needed to take walled and well-defended cities. Hence, if a city fell, as I mentioned before, it almost always fell after treachery, or more often, it just switched sides after one side, Carthage or Rome, won a pivotal battle. Treachery, though, was also, treacherous. It was hard to determine how much to trust a group willing to betray their fellow citizens. There were several times during the First Punic War when a commander believed and offered to defect only to find himself and his advance guard surrounded and massacred. Frankly, given our sources, it's difficult to provide a chronological narrative of the First Punic War on land. There are a lot of sieges, surprise attacks, raids, and then frequently long periods when absolutely nothing happened at all. What I can say is that over time, the Romans were willing to devote more and more resources to the island, while Carthage was not. Eventually, this tipped the scales in their favor in such a way that there simply was no coming back for Carthage. But I guess it's important to note that throughout the First Punic War, and maybe this explains why there's a Second Punic War, Carthage never really loses a decisive battle on land. They're going on sea, but not on land. It was much more a war of attrition. In 256 BCE, the Romans launched a full-scale invasion of North Africa. This was as a result of the massive naval victory at Ecnomus, which I will discuss in a minute. The hero of the day was the Roman consul, Marcus Atilius Regulus. Many myths came to be surrounding Regulus, and as with all other important figures of the First Punic War, including Hero, the tyrant of Syracuse, and Hamilcar Barca, it is now impossible to know what sort of a man he was. He was clearly an able commander, and if he was perhaps over-aggressive, this was a common trait in Roman commanders, and not considered a vice. One tradition claimed that Regulus was impoverished by senatorial standards, and it was only reluctantly, following an assurance by the Senate that they would provide for his wife and children at state expense, that he accepted the Africa command. However, But this anecdote is highly moralistic and, therefore, almost certainly a later invention as part of the myth surrounding Regulus. Regulus's army in Africa consisted of 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. It was probably a standard consular army, if maybe an understrength one, since Polybius later mentions a first legion, which implies that he had at least two. The disproportionately low number of cavalry was of course a result of the difficulty of transporting the horses across the sea from Italy. Now, once Carthage realized it could not prevent Regulus from landing nearby Cape Bon, it immediately looked to its own defenses. 2 generals were elected, and a third, Hamilcar Barca, was recalled from Sicily with 5,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. Together, we're not sure how large Carthage's army was, but no source indicates a disproportionate advantage on either side, so it was probably about as big as Rome's army. While the Carthaginians were not about to risk a pitched battle, if they lost, then Carthage would be totally undefended, they did their best to shadow the Roman force so it could not pillage with impunity. However, the Romans believed they had the advantage. So, in a somewhat surprising move, they immediately advanced on the Carthaginian camp, though Carthage held the high ground. We should remember here that the goal was probably to put enough pressure on Carthage to force a surrender on terms favorable to Rome. It was not to conquer North Africa. Not yet, at least. Polybius tells us that the Romans attacked the hilltop camp at dawn, but another historian says the assault occurred at night, although his claim that many Carthaginians were killed in their beds seems unlikely. It is possible that a nighttime approach march was followed by a dawn attack, for it seems that the Carthaginians did not have a significant enough warning to deploy more than a part of their army. 2 Roman columns assaulted from opposite sides of the camp. A group of mercenaries did manage to form up and drive back the First Legion in considerable disorder, but then it pursued too rashly. They were attacked from the rear by the other Roman force and themselves routed. Their defeat seemed to have marked the end of an effective resistance, and the rest of the army abandoned the camp in a panicked flight, although the cavalry and elephants escaped with few casualties once they reached the level ground. The bold attack had been an outstanding success, but the repulse of the First Legion emphasized the risks involved. The twin attack does not appear to have occurred simultaneously, perhaps as a result of the nighttime approach march, although in the event that this resulted in the fortuitous appearance of the second Roman force in the mercenaries' rear. Had the Romans been detected during their approach, they risked having to fight a deployed Carthaginian army attacking down from high ground. However, it is worth noting, once again, that a recently created Carthaginian force failed to coordinate its different elements effectively, and successful mercenary counterattack was never supported. The Romans followed up their success by taking Tunis, using it as a base to mount raids in the area around Carthage itself. The Carthaginians at this point were depressed. In the last year, their proud navy, which had put to sea with more ships than ever before, had been decisively defeated at Ecnomus, and now their army, tasked with defending the capital itself, had been beaten with ease by Regulus. At the same time, they were involved in bitter fighting with the Numidian kingdoms, resulting from attempts to expand Carthaginian territory in Africa, a policy which had been pursued alongside the struggle with Rome. Refugees from areas raided by the Numidians, as well as the Romans, flooded into Carthage itself, spreading panic and creating some food shortages. According to Polybius, it was at this point that Regulus guessed that the enemy might be willing to negotiate to end the war, and sent peace envoys, which were welcomed at first by the Carthaginians. He was said to be nervous that his first year of office had nearly expired, and that he might not have finished the war before a successor arrived to gain an easy victory. Similar motivation clearly did influence the behavior of the other Roman magistrates. All our other sources agree that it was the Carthaginians who actually began the negotiations after their recent defeats. Only Dio, of all of our historians, claims to preserve the details of the terms dictated by Regulus. but their absence from all earlier sources can only make their authenticity unlikely to dubious. For what they're worth, these were that the Carthaginians should give up both Sicily and Sardinia, release all Roman prisoners freely while ransoming their own, pay the Romans an indemnity, an annual tribute, only make war and peace on the approval of Rome, and only retain one warship for their own use, but to provide 50 to serve under the Romans whenever they requested. In several respects, notably the inclusion of Sardinia, these terms are harsher than the treaty which actually does conclude the war in 241 BCE. Whatever the precise details, it is clear that Regulus sought to impose a treaty which forced the Carthaginians to admit defeat, that is, total defeat, their war with Rome. All our sources state that the Carthaginians felt the terms were far harsher than their actual fortunes in the war. Despite its recent setbacks, the city was by no means out of resources. Faced with a Roman refusal to grant any concession, the talks failed. During the winter of 255, the Carthaginians reformed their army. According to our sources, most of the actual reforming was done by a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus. To an extent, this is probably our sources waxing romantically about the glorious Spartan military prowess of old. But Xanthippus was critical of Carthage's prior decision to fight the Romans on unfavorable ground, where their cavalry and elephants could not be brought to bear. Regardless, Carthaginian morale improved. And by spring, Carthage had assembled a new army of 12,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 100 elephants, all prepared to fight using Spartan techniques. The scene was now set for the only true land battle of the First Punic War that resembles anything like those of the Second. This is referred to in our sources as the Battle of Tunis, though no one knows exactly where it was really fought. The Romans eagerly accepted Carthage's offer of battle because they wanted to inflict the decisive, crushing blow. Xanthippus is credited for the Carthaginian battle formation, which placed the citizen phalanx in the center, with mercenaries on the right and left, the cavalry on the wings, and the elephants out in front of the infantry in a single line. We're told that Regulus lined up the legions in deeper maniples than usual. What this means remains a matter of conjecture, but the most likely interpretation is that the Romans still lined up in the triple axis, but that each line was a little deeper, not that they abandoned or substantially modified their usual battle formation. The Romans, consequently, wouldn't actually abandon the triple axis until the 1st century BCE. The main advantage of deeper lines was that it would make it harder for panicking men to turn and run at the sight of the elephants. But because the lines were deeper, they couldn't be as long, leaving both flanks vulnerable and possibly enveloped. After a delay of the type that's so common before these sorts of pitched battles, Xanthippus ordered the elephants to attack and the Romans moved forward to meet them, raising a battle cry and rhythmically banging their weapons against their shields in what Polybius describes as their usual custom. The Roman cavalry, facing odds of at least 4-1, were almost immediately routed. The 2,000 men on the left flank of the Roman infantry line, who normally would have been allied troops, actually achieved considerable success. Eager to avoid the elephants and contemptuous of the mercenaries, again we're quoting Polybius here, who had been defeated in the previous battle, they just charged the units on the enemy right flank, routed them immediately, and chased them back to their camp. Elsewhere, the Roman infantry didn't do quite as well. They reeled under the onslaught of a mass of elephants and took heavy casualties, though, to be fair, the depth of their formation prevented them from breaking. A few maniples and small groups fought their way past the animals, and after reforming, moved against the Carthaginian phalanx. Their pila were now gone and greatly outnumbered, however, they were easily defeated. In the meantime, the Carthaginian cavalry had swept in against the flanks of the Roman infantry. Their attacks robbed the Roman formation of what forward impetus it had left, as flanking maniples had to turn to face the new threat. Struck by missiles from cavalry or trampled by the elephants, the Romans were destroyed whether they stood their ground or turned to flee. Regulus and 500 men initially made their escape, but were quickly captured. Only the 2,000 men who had broken through the mercenaries were able to retire in decent order, eventually making their way back to Aspis, which, with the troops left there, they successfully defended until evacuation by a Roman fleet later that year. This was the only substantial portion of the Roman army to escape, though. Polybius records losses of 800 men amongst the routed mercenaries, but it doesn't give us a figure for the casualties suffered by the rest of the army. This was the most striking success achieved by elephants throughout the course of the Punic Wars, and had a great morale effect on the Roman armies in Sicily, who for the next few years didn't dare to try to contest control of open ground with the Carthaginians for fear of being attacked by elephants. However, it's important to note that the victory had not been achieved by the elephants alone, and it owed a great deal of successful cavalry actions, which had allowed the envelopment of the Roman infantry, which is kind of what I warned was the problem with the Roman formation in the first place. If Regulus's plan had been to use his superior infantry to break the enemy's main line before the numerically superior cavalry could come into play, it had simply failed, and in part it had failed probably because of the elephants. At Trebia, in 218, a future battle, a substantial part of another Roman army, which had been defeated on both wings, was able to burst through the Carthaginian line and escape. However, Regulus's army was about 1/3 the size of that later force, which made it much easier for the Punic cavalry to envelop the infantry center. Even more so, as its deeper formation could only have reduced the front of the lines. Xanthippus, interestingly enough, departed after his success, aware, and this is according to Polybius, of the jealousy of the Carthaginian nobility, and subsequently he actually served under the Ptolemies in Egypt. Later, there was this deeply romantic tradition that developed around Regulus, claiming that the Carthaginians sent him as an ambassador to Rome to negotiate for the ransom of Roman prisoners. But he, again, this is romantic and famous, advised the Roman Senate against making the agreement. Bound an oath to return to Carthage, Regulus nobly kept his faith and refused to stay in Rome, in spite of the fact that he knew that if he went back, he would suffer a cruel death by torture. And guess what? He did. One source says that his eyelids were first cut off and then he was finally trampled to death by an enraged elephant. Another tradition told how his wife was given 2 eminent Carthaginian captives and in vengeance for her husband had them brutally maltreated until one died. Sometimes scholars have been tempted to accept this part of the account and claim that the Regulus story was invented to excuse his family's cruelty. But it's probably safer for us to honestly just reject the whole thing, especially because absolutely none of this is mentioned by Polybius. The African campaign was one of the most dramatic events of the First Punic War. It ultimately revived Carthage's confidence. Rome made no further attempts to invade after Regulus's defeat. The question has actually been ever since, why did the Romans invade North Africa in the first place? The most logical response is that Regulus wanted to put pressure on the Carthaginians to force the city's ultimate capitulation. But I think there's another reason here. Opportunity. Regulus had the opportunity, and aggressiveness was what Roman commanders were supposed to be. Some later writers blamed Regulus for trying to get treaty terms that were too harsh after his first victory. But it's difficult to imagine another Roman general doing anything else. Rome always fought until its enemy admitted total defeat and a subservient status. Carthage fought wars like they were part of a business strategy. Rome fought to the death. To a large extent, it explains why they won. By the late 250s, Carthage's Sicilian possessions were reduced to the northwest corner of the island. When Panorius fell, one of the few large cities still loyal to Carthage, it seemed like Carthage's time on the island was over. In late 250, a Roman army routed a Carthaginian one at Lilybaeum, which had fallen to the Romans years earlier and had subsequently traded hands quite a few times. Essentially, in this case, the Carthaginian commander allowed himself to be drawn closer and closer to the walls until the Roman reinforcements poured forth from the gate and destroyed their opponent. According to our sources, Carthage suffered between 20 to 30,000 men lost, but this is clearly a gross exaggeration. Regardless, this was one of the last massed land actions of the war. The last few years of the conflict only saw various blockades and siege actions as the Romans painstakingly took city after city. It is in the last years of the war in Sicily that the most famous of all Carthaginian generals of the conflict appeared on the scene, Hamilcar Barca. His name was a suitably dramatic one, derived from the Semitic word for lightning, or perhaps sword, like the flashing of a sword. But his greatest achievements were to come after the war with Rome. And it's doubtful whether or not he would have gotten as much attention as he has in history were he not the father of Hannibal. And this time, yes, I'm talking about the Hannibal. Nevertheless, Polybius considered him the ablest commander on either side throughout the first conflict. By the time that he landed in Sicily in 247, the Carthaginians had been hemmed into a small enclave. He established himself on a hill called Hercute, not far from Penorius, a secure base with command of a good anchorage. For 3 years, he skirmished with the Roman forces near the city, winning minor victories, but not achieving anything in the long term. Then, in 244, he withdrew at night and sailed to Irx near Drepana. The Romans had captured the abandoned town in 248, installing a garrison there on the mountain's summit. Hamilcar captured the town in a surprise attack, cutting off the force on the summit, which was occupying the Temple of Venus, from the main Roman forces at the foot of the mountain. He managed to maintain this position and besiege the force for the remaining years of the war, again winning minor successes in the frequent raiding and skirmishing that was pursued by both sides. Hamilcar didn't have the resources, though, to do anything more. Certainly, he could not face the Romans in an open, pitched battle. We do not know this for certain, but historians now believe that it's highly likely that Carthage was dealing with internal revolts back in North Africa and could no longer afford to devote the men or money, really money, to what looked like a losing cause in Sicily. Again, for Carthage, the war was really a business decision. Regardless, the land action in the First Punic War was, to all practical purposes, irrelevant. The First Punic War, as we will turn to now, was decided at sea. The First Punic War was the greatest naval conflict of antiquity. The resources both sides lavished on their fleets were truly enormous, and their losses in men and material staggering. If our sources are correct, then the Battle of Ecnomus in 256 may have involved more people than any other sea battle in history. Sea battles were more common than major land actions during the war and ultimately proved decisive. Polybius marveled at the scale of the naval war, but even more at the speed with which the Romans, who, he claims, had never before built a warship, adapted to the sea and created a navy able to defeat Carthage with its long maritime tradition. The early years of the naval conflict witnessed a spectacular, almost unbroken string of Roman successes over an enemy whose ships were better constructed and whose crews far more skillful. When the war ended in 241, Rome will have replaced Carthage as the unchallenged sea power in the Western Mediterranean. The navies created during the war made possible all the later victories over Carthage again in the Second and Third Punic Wars, and then in the Eastern Mediterranean against the various Hellenistic kingdoms. Polybius' assertion that the Romans had no experience at all at sea prior to the First Punic War is hyperbole, but not by much. The Romans had not needed sea power to conquer Italy. Only in 311 had the Romans created two posts responsible for the construction and maintenance of warships. Even in the early 3rd century, Rome continued to rely upon its Italian allies for its fleet. Indeed, in the early stages of the First Punic War, it was Allied ships, not Roman ships per se, that transported the legions to Sicily and provided naval support. Polybius was not wrong in his assertion that, however small it was, the Roman navy truly developed in the First Punic War. Regardless, so in 261 BCE, the Roman Senate voted to construct a fleet of 100 quinquiremes and 20 triremes, capable of directly confronting the Carthaginians. It's very possible that this vote mirrored a change in war aims resulting from the fall of Agrigentum, but we can't be certain of that. There is one record of a council arguing for the construction of a fleet as early as 263. Either way, honestly, given the reality that Sicily was, and still is, an island, I cannot see how the Romans ever thought that they would be able to claim it using land power alone. Hence, whenever the idea came about for the construction of a fleet, it was an inevitability if the Romans truly wanted to win the war. Now, recounting just how naval combat functioned in the ancient and classical world is extremely difficult. In general, the ancient sources are far less informative about operations in sea than they are on land. The problem is made worse by the essentially alien nature of oared warships to the modern age. Maritime archaeology has started to provide some information, although wrecks of warships rather than merchantmen are exceptionally uncommon, and much less has been learned by reconstruction therefore. Nevertheless, there are numerous gaps in our understanding of the construction and maintenance of classical galleys, which is what we imagine when we imagine classical maritime warfare, and especially of the strategic and tactical uses of these fleets. An indication of all of this is our uncertainty as to the precise design of what was the standard warship of the Punic Wars, the quinquireme. The great naval battles of the 5th century, when the Greeks had defeated the Persian invaders and Athens and Sparta had vied for dominance, were fought and won by triremes. The evidence for this type of ship is actually pretty good, much of it coming from the literature of classical Athens and excavations of shipyards in the Piraeus harbor. The full-scale reconstruction of an Athenian trireme in the 1980s and its extensive sea trials vastly increased our knowledge. The trireme, or three as I'm going to call it, derived its name from the basic rowing group of 3 men. Each man sat on a different level and operated an oar of about 14 feet or so in length, those of the upper row projecting from an outrigger. Considerable skill was required in each oarsman for the successful functioning of the ship. It was long and sleek. In fact, the Athenian trireme was about 120 feet in length, but just under 20 feet across its widest. It carried a crew of about 200, around 30 of who were deck crew officers and marines, and the remainder of which were all rowers, so about 170 rowers. In trials, the reconstructed version reached speeds of 8 knots and could maintain a steady 4 knots for hours on end, with half the rowers resting at any one given time. Turns through 180 degrees were completed in a distance equivalent to 2.5 ship lengths. These speeds were achieved despite the comparative inexperience of the modern crew and their use of oars, which were probably heavier than the originals. Under sail, the trireme was able to achieve 8 knots in a favorable breeze. All in all, the performance of the reconstructed trireme was remarkably good and challenged many past assumptions about ancient naval warfare. In the 4th century, several Hellenistic states began to construct larger warships than the trireme. The Carthaginians were the first to build 4s, or quadriremes, while Dionysius I, the tyrant of Syracuse in the early 4th century, was responsible for the design of the 5. This is called the pentereus in Greek, or the quinquireme in Latin. The kingdoms which emerged in the Hellenistic world in the late 4th century were able to lavish huge resources on the construction of their fleets. Some of the largest ships were built by the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, including, according to legend, such massive ships as Ptolemy II's 30s and 40s, but there's no record of anything actually larger than a 10 seeing real combat. The realization that, although the trireme had 3 banks of oars, its name derived in fact from the number of each team of rowers goes a long way towards understanding the design of these ships. Clearly, galleys with 4 or 5 banks of oars would have been incredibly impractical, and ones with 10 or more, impossible. In fact, there's no evidence for any warship in the classical world ever having more than 3 banks of oars. Therefore, 4s and larger ships like quinquiremes, 5s you might call them, at least some of these oars had to have been operated by more than one rower. The quinquireme had a basic team of 5 rowers. But how were they arranged? Did it have one level of oars rowed by 5 men each, 2 levels, one rowed by 3, one rowed by 2? Or 3 levels, with 2 oars operated by a pair of rowers and one by a single man? There were navies of the Mediterranean powers in the late Middle Ages, including many galleys, and all of these had a single bank of oars, regardless as to how many rowers operated each one. 2 men can sit side by side, and they can operate an oar effectively. But if there are more than 2 rowers per oar, then it's necessary for them to rise to their feet and dip the blade, and then hurl themselves back to the bench when they deliver the stroke. Now, this was the method that was employed in the Middle Ages, and must also have been used in some of the larger galleys in the classical world. Of necessity, this design required a somewhat broader and heavier hull to accommodate the rowers, which probably made them slower and less maneuverable than the sleeker types like triremes. There has been a suggestion by different historians that this system of having multiple rowers per oar was actually more effective, and the reason is because you actually only need one skilled rower. As long as the other 2 can just simply follow the instructions of that man, then you don't need quite as many. And this was the basis upon which historians have assumed that Carthage came into the conflict with the superior navy. Not that they had tens of thousands of expertly skilled rowers, but that they may have had 10,000 that were then spread out across all the various ships at different points. This might explain why the Punic ships were individually faster and more maneuverable than their Roman counterparts. However, Polybius tells us explicitly that the Roman ships were copied from a captured design of a Carthaginian 5, and there seems no good reason to reject this evidence. The superior performance of the Carthaginian ships for most of the war was a reflection of their more highly trained crews, and at the very beginning, better construction, not from a fundamentally different design. On the whole, it's more likely that the quinquiremes of this period had more than one bank of oars. 2 levels of oars with 3 and 2 rowers respectively would have meant an uneasy combination of 2 different designs. And it's more probable that the quinquireme had 3 levels, the lowest with a single rower and the others with a pair. This would make the quinquireme a more logical development from the trireme directly. The upper levels of oars in a trireme were mounted in an outrigger, and this has sometimes been perceived as a weakness. Even if that's true, it would have remained a failing in similarly designed 5s, and it's distinctly possible that the quinquiremes of the Punic Wars were constructed differently. There were 2 main tactical options open to ancient galleys: ramming and boarding. Given the limitations of technology at the time, there simply was no amount of projectiles that could be launched by any one ship to incapacitate another. Missiles were useful to clear an enemy deck before boarding, but any decisive result, just like on land, required 2 opposing ships to close with one another and fight it out. Rams started out as pointed, but even by the 5th century they'd been refashioned into blunt objects. Why? Well, a pointed ram just ran too much of a risk of being stuck to the enemy hull. This is why rams were built onto, but were never part of the ship's keel. Likewise, ships never tried to ram each other head on. That is to say, you would never aim for the bow of an opposing ship. That was the strongest part of both ships and would almost certainly result in major damage to both should it have been attempted. Instead, any decent captain would try to ram a ship's side. Ideally, you would actually strike the side at an angle, puncturing not just one hole, but a series of holes. In reality, what this meant was that ancient naval warfare devolved into a series of one-on-one duels, much like aerial combat during the First World War. There were some larger strategies, likely employed by squadrons of ships, but it's highly unlikely whole naval squadrons worked in tandem somehow. And certainly not an entire navy. That's just not possible. Given the limitations of communication, such seems just unbelievable. Now, the likelier scenario wasn't ramming, it was boarding. This is for a few reasons. Ramming requires a lot of technical skill, and not just for the commander either. All the rowers needed to be highly trained and needed to spend hundreds of hours learning how to row together. This worked in a state like classical Athens, which had manpower resources and a willingness to devote the time to developing these skills. But Rome needed to fill the legions, not the rowers' benches. Boarding, on the other hand, required a lot less skill. You just had to get close enough to grapple the enemy ship, and then it basically turned into a land battle on the water. That was what the Romans wanted to do, and by and large, it was what all Hellenistic kingdoms sought to do as well. It's worth remembering that all of these vessels were powered by oarsmen. Thus, their crews were huge, by comparison, of course, to later sailing ships. As a result, it was both only common to take on marines directly before a major combat, and also impossible for these ships to spend long periods of time on the water since they couldn't carry many supplies. The majority of the ships that the Romans constructed for the First Punic War were fives, so quinquiremes, with 5 rows for oarsmen. Polybius tells us that the designs for these ships were modeled on a Carthaginian craft that ran aground during the initial phase of the conflict. I mentioned that 2 episodes ago, actually. Whether it's completely true or not is pure speculation, but it is interesting to think that an incident of pure happenstance might have altered the course of history. Certainly, southern Italian Roman allies have been making 5s for decades. However, it has long been thought that this particular design for a 5 was different. Specifically, Carthaginian design, that it was superior to at least have been, or thought to have been superior to anything else presently in construction. Regardless, what we do know is that the Romans used the same template for all the 5s they constructed throughout the wars. We know this because the remains of these ships have markers still present on the beams, showing the workmen where and how to cut them. This allowed the Romans to fit together multiple beams using joints which were much longer than the natural wood. Using a template for consistent designs is something that had hitherto been thought impossible before the Industrial Revolution. As with many things, the Romans were a bit ahead of the curve. These huge ships took not only massive crews of workmen to build, but also would have required in total 30,000 rowers if we multiply it out for all the ships. Certainly, some of these would have been provided by Roman allies. However, I think it's certain, despite Roman attitudes at the time toward naval warfare, that a good number of these oarsmen were the urban poor from Rome itself. These men would not have met the property qualifications for service in the legions. Now, one of the earliest engagements of the naval war in the First Punic War was a painful setback for Rome. One of the 2 Roman consuls for 260 BCE, Gnaeus Scipio, received word that Lipara, a crucial town not far from Messana, wanted to defect to the Roman side. Scipio believed them and took 17 ships and occupied the harbor. What happened next is still a matter of debate. Whether this was all a ruse from the beginning, we're not sure. But regardless, Hannibal sent 20 ships of his own and blockaded the Romans in. Their crews panicked and quickly surrendered, and Scipio found himself in captivity. Don't worry too much about him, though. He won the consulship again in 254. But soon after this success, Hannibal managed to stumble upon a major Roman fleet, while his fleet was scattered and unprepared. Our reports for this are murky, but he seems to have lost at least 25 ships as a result. What these two events highlight is just how difficult it was to maneuver a large fleet in the classical world, when no one really knew where the enemy was. The Romans remained eager for a major confrontation, however. Their desire for such was only heightened when probably one of their best commanders of the entire First Punic War arrived, Caius Duilius. The Romans realized that their ships were neither as fast nor as maneuverable as their Punic counterparts. They'd copied the methods of their construction, but as of yet they couldn't duplicate the skill of the Carthaginian shipwrights, and even more importantly, Roman crews were far inferior. It was clear that they could anticipate little success if they relied on ramming to defeat the enemy, and that therefore they had to depend on getting close to boarding. To this, someone put forward the idea of a new type of boarding bridge, known to modern historians by the Latin word corvus, which means raven, although no ancient author employs the term, and Polybius uses the equivalent Greek word corvax. The name of its inventor has not been recorded, so some have suggested that the man was a Sicilian Greek, a foreigner with whom the Romans had no wish to share the glory of the subsequent success the corvus brought. Or even that the inventor may have been the young Archimedes, but of course, this is just conjecture. Later sources view the corvus as some sort of grapnel, which encouraged historians to doubt Polybius' description. But the reliability of his account was finally confirmed when, later on, a constructed, viable working model of the engine was made in the early 20th century. The corvus was a boarding bridge. It was 4 feet wide and 36 feet long, with a knee-high parapet on either side. The last third of its length formed the 2 prongs separated by a long groove, slotted around a 20-foot-4 high pole erected on the deck of the ship. Pulleys allowed the bridge to be raised at any angle against the pole. Underneath the raised end of the bridge was a heavy, pointed spike, resembling a bird's beak, from which the device probably got its name. When released, the corvus fell onto the deck of an enemy ship. The spike embedded itself into the planking. The groove allowed the bridge to be swung around in a wide arc to fall ahead or on either side of the ship's bow, depending on the direction of the approaching enemy. Once the bridge was securely fixed in the other vessel, the Roman marines could swarm across and overwhelm the enemy crew with their skill as swordsmen. It was a simple, practical device, allowing the Romans to extend their advantages in land fighting to naval battles, and it enjoyed spectacular success during its relatively brief career. Soon after his arrival with the fleet, Duilius received a report that the Carthaginian fleet had been raided around an area called Mylae, a city situated on a peninsula on the northern coast of Sicily. The entire Roman fleet put to sea and moved around the coast towards Mylae, and soon as this was reported to Hannibal, he prepared his fleet to meet them. Polybius tells us that the Carthaginians mustered 130 ships, which seems more likely than Diodorus' figure of 200. Hannibal himself led the action from a hepteres, or 7, which might have actually been captured from Pyrrhus way back in 276. The Romans had what was left of their original 120 ships, minus the 17 that were lost by Scipio, plus however many Punic ships were captured in the earlier engagement they had been able to salvage and man, as well as any other vessels provided by their naval allies. The bulk of ships on both sides were presumably quinquiremes, 5s, and it's improbable that either fleet was markedly bigger than the other. Polybius tells us that the Carthaginians were confused by the strange appearance of the tall corvus near the prow of each Roman ship, but remained supremely confident of their own superiority over their inexperienced enemy. It was extremely difficult for the commander of an ancient fleet to exercise much control over his squadrons during a battle. But Hannibal appears to have allowed his fleet to just get out of hand out the gate. The Punic ships surged toward the enemy, with the Great 7 in the front. Some of the Roman ships were rammed, but each was able to drop its corvus, whose beak speared through the deck of the enemy vessel and held them tight. 30 Punic warships, all those who had first engaged, were grappled and held fast. Amongst them was Hannibal's flagship, attacked by a trireme according to Zenorius, although he tends to use that word as a generic term for a warship, and it was more likely that the ship was a Roman 5, since the difference in height between a 7 and 5 would have been just unbelievable. In each case, the Roman marines poured across the boarding bridges and swiftly defeated the enemy crews. Hannibal abandoned his flagship and escaped in a small rowing boat. The remainder of the Carthaginian fleet then took advantage of the superior speed of their vessels and swung around, outflanking the Roman line and attacking it from astern, hoping in this way to avoid the Corvus. Somehow, we don't know how, the Romans were able to maneuver to meet this new onslaught. And once again, any Punic ship which came within the range was pinned and held tight by the Corvus. Polybius describes how boarding bridges, quote, swung around and plunged down in all directions, end quote, but we're not clear what he means by this. A corvus, mounted near the prow of a ship, would have been able to be dropped ahead and for a short distance to the port or starboard, but clearly it could not have reached the stern. Evidently, a Roman ship seeing an enemy vessel approaching would have tried to turn to bring the enemy within the arc. Many historians have suggested that the Roman ships may have been formed into two lines, and that it was the second line which turned to face the second Punic attack. But while this is certainly plausible, our sources are simply too brief for us to be able to confirm or deny it. The ease with which the Carthaginians were able to subsequently disengage and retreat once again confirmed the superior speed of their ships, but they had failed to achieve anything positive because of this advantage. It was a spectacular success for the new Roman fleet, owed almost exclusively to the ingenuity of whoever designed the Corvus. According to Polybius, 50 Punic ships were lost, although our later sources give 33 won captured and 13 to 14 sunk, figures which may derive from the inscription that was later erected by Duilius himself in commemoration of his victory. It's called the Columna Rostra, although this has survived in fragmentary form, so only the first X of a numeral can be read. The tone of the surviving text is very typical of the Roman aristocracy's self-promotion, with its emphasis on having been the first Roman to ever defeat a Punic navy, claiming in his land operations, Duilius defeated all the greatest of the Carthaginian forces. This text actually mentions only triremes and is being reconstructed as also mentioning quinquiremes, which might offer additional confirmation for our suspicion that the fleets of this conflict were not exclusively quinquiremes or fives. The new man, Duilius, celebrated Rome's first naval triumph ever, decorating the speaker's platform in the forum with the prows, or rostra, cut off from captured ships, from which the speaker's platform would later derive its name. When Duilius went out to dine at Rome, he was accompanied to and from his host's house by a procession of musicians. But interestingly enough, in spite of all these great honors, he never went on to accomplish much more later in his career. Now, Hannibal survived the disastrous defeat, but not for long. He was put to death by his own officers not long afterwards. There were no other major sea confrontations until 257, when the Roman consul, Caius Regulus, managed to inflict a relatively significant defeat on the main fleet, capturing 10 ships and sinking 8. The main Punic force, however, withdrew, not interested in fighting a full-scale battle at that point. In 256, the Romans made their bold but characteristic decision to escalate the conflict by mounting the invasion of North Africa I talked about before. To accomplish this, they amassed an enormous fleet of 330 vessels, which moved along the Italian coast and crossed to Messana before sailing south along the Sicilian shore past Syracuse, and then linking up with the main army. The pick of the Roman infantry were taken on board to serve as marines and provide an invasion force, so that now each quinquireme had a complement of around 120 marines. Polybius claimed that the combined total of the crews of marines in the Roman fleet was around 140,000 men. The Carthaginians had managed to put together a grand total of 350 ships, which sailed from Africa to Lilybaeum before moving around to the southern coast of Sicily. Polybius gives us their strength in men as more than 150,000, presumably calculated on the assumption that their crews are roughly the same size as those of the Romans. Certainly, most modern historians believe that Polybius's numbers are inflated, but it's impossible to say by how much. So, for the purposes of the Battle of Ecnomus, the only major battle of the war, frankly, I'm going to assume the numbers are roughly accurate. Essentially, the Roman fleet set sail with two intentions. Either there would be a major engagement, or they would continue on to North Africa. But it seems that the Carthaginians had resolved that a battle off the coast of Sicily offered them the best chance of protecting their capital city. Such was the importance of this venture that both of that year's consuls, Lucius Manlius Vulso and Marcus Attius Regulus, were present. They had divided the fleet into 4 divisions, numbered 1 to 4 and labeled as either squadrons or legions. This was simply a nickname and bore no relation to their actual size, and it seems that the 4 divisions were not equal in numbers. The first 2 groups were led by the consuls themselves, whose 2 sixes headed the Roman formation. The other ships from these squadrons took station from the flagships in line, echeloned back to either side, so that each ship's prow lay behind and to the side of the ship in front. So imagine now, in effect, these squadrons formed the tip of a triangle. The base was then composed of the 3rd squadron, which was arrayed in a line abreast, each ship towing one of the horse transports. The 4th squadron was behind this group, and probably more numerous than the 3rd, because its ships overlapped its line on either flank. Protecting the rear of the formation, and acting as the ultimate reserve, this 4th squadron was also nicknamed the Triarii. The Roman formation was praised by Polybius for its practicality, being relatively dense and keeping the fleet together, but also permitting it to turn and face a threat from any direction. It was a sign of the improved quality of Roman crews and the greater experience of their commanders that they were able to adopt such a plan. And there's no good reason to doubt Polybius's account or assume that he had misunderstood what was no more than an accidental formation. The Carthaginians made some changes to their deployment once the Roman fleet came into view, having apparently advanced in a normal battle formation in simple line abreast. The Carthaginian line was formed with the coast of Sicily to its left. The left wing, 1/4 of the fleet's ships, reached forward towards the shore. Angled away from this was the remainder of the fleet to the extreme right, which was commanded by Hanno. He's the same general who had failed to relieve Agrigentum back in 261. This was made up as the fastest ships and extended beyond the flank of the Roman formation. The center was led by the overall commander in Sicily, Hamilcar, who had instructed the captains of his division to begin by withdrawing in the face of a Roman attack. Hamilcar's plan appears to have been to break up the compact Roman formation so that his divisions on the right and left could sweep in and attack the enemy from the flank, or, best case scenario, the rear. This would produce a series of smaller encounters between parts of each fleet in which the Carthaginians might hope to exploit their skill in ramming tactics and avoid frontal attacks on the corvus-equipped Roman ships. Some historians have made efforts to suggest a far more complicated Carthaginian battle plan, but to be honest with you, those are speculative and not convincing. The battle began just as Hamilcar had hoped. The Romans saw the large gaps between the Punic ships in the center, and they drove straight at them. As instructed, Hamilcar's ships withdrew, and the Roman compact formation began to spread out, as those ships towing the horse convoys couldn't keep up. When enough of a gap opened up, Hamilcar gave the signal, and his ships wheeled around. Both sides engaged, and a series of individual duels developed, with fierce fighting up and down the lines. Meanwhile, Hanno's right wing was successful in enveloping the third Roman line, which had to cast the horse convoys adrift to effectively take part in the action. Hence, what we have here is actually 3 separate battles within a battle. You would expect that this would probably favor Carthage, but it didn't. Why? Well, there's a few reasons. First, the Romans were just much better trained than they had been back in 260. Second, Carthage's own naval expansion watered down the effectiveness of its crews. Third, and by far and away most importantly, at least in my view, Carthage still had no answer for the deadly Corvus. The Romans quickly defeated the Carthaginian center. After Hamilcar's ships gave up the fight and fled, this allowed the Roman consuls to wheel back and help the third line. There, Carthage had actually been winning, but now the Romans closed on their rear and effectively sandwiched the remaining Punic fleet between them. The battle was over. Rome had triumphed. Before this war, no one would have thought it even conceivable that Rome would defeat Carthage in a major naval engagement. And it is a testament to Rome's willingness to adapt and change. In the end, the Romans lost 24 ships, all sunk. Carthage lost 64 ships by boarding, plus another 30 that sunk to the bottom of the sea. A total disaster. It was the largest clash of the war, and might even still to this day have been the largest naval battle in history in terms of the number of people who took part, which is saying something. Afterwards, the Carthaginian fleets retreated in 3 different directions. The Romans returned to Sicily and made repairs before continuing their voyage to North Africa, the result of which I discussed earlier. In 255, after Regulus was finally beaten in North Africa, 2 new Roman consuls sailed to North Africa. There they gathered the survivors and even defeated another Punic fleet on their way. But their success was short-lived. A massive storm struck the fleet as it made its way back to Sicily. According to Polybius, all but 60 ships were lost. If this is true, then Rome might have suffered a loss ratio in this storm of nearly 89%. We have no idea if these numbers were 100% accurate, but clearly it's a huge loss. Some scholars have argued that the corvus actually made the galley more susceptible to sinking in a storm. That's saying something. Galleys are already really susceptible to sinking in the storm because they just kind of ride so low on the water. Modern recreations suggest that this was highly likely, though how much of a role that played in the catastrophe is hard to say. The following year, 254, 220 ships, new ships, were built and floated in just 3 months. An incredible achievement, which shows just how Rome didn't so much always win in combat as it just simply refused to lose. It was this fleet in 250 that then blockaded and took Ecnomus, perhaps the last major Carthaginian city on Sicily. So from this point forward in the First Punic War, most of the engagements are quite minor. Rome continued to raid the North African coast, but in 253 it lost another 150 ships in a storm, suggesting that Carthage would have been better off never engaging the Romans and just letting the sea do its work for it. In 249, one of the 2 consuls for the year, Publius Claudius Pulcher, decided to launch a surprise attack on the last Punic naval depot on Sicily, Drepana. It was an audacious move, but Claudius was an audacious man. This is the man who, famously, when told that the auspicious signs for a battle were poor, because the sacred chickens wouldn't eat, grabbed them and hurled them overboard, proclaiming that if they would not eat, then he would let them drink. However, despite his reputation for arrogance, Claudius's initial preparations were careful enough. He put to sea at night to avoid being spotted, and news of his departure being carried by land to Drepana and sailed along the coast. However, in the darkness, it was difficult for the Romans' ships to remain in a close formation, especially since they were crewed by a mixture of experienced rowers and brand new draftees. The route was simple to follow since it hugged the coast, but throughout the night, the Roman fleet straggled, and by the morning it was a long, scattered line as it approached the enemy base. Claudius's flagship was somewhere, not sure where, near the rear. The Romans were spotted, and word brought to Adherbal, actually someone not named Hannibal or Hamilcar, the Punic admiral, who then took the bold decision to put to sea and confront the enemy. He didn't want to permit himself to be blockaded into the harbor. He gathered his crews and collected large numbers of mercenaries to act as marines. It now became a matter of time as to whether or not the Carthaginian fleet would escape from the harbor and gain the sea room before the Roman ships were able to block the entrance. The disordered and scattered formation of the Roman fleet and the poorer quality of their crews proved decisive, but honestly, only in the narrowest of margins. The entrance to the harbor at Drepana was wide, and as the first Roman ships were entering its southernmost edge, Adherbal's flagship was rowing out past the long spit of land which formed the northern edge. He signaled the rest of the fleet to follow him, so the Carthaginian ships proceeded in line astern, rounded the two small islands opposite the harbor mouth, and then turned southward, parallel to the coast, but further out to the sea than the Roman fleet. Claudius knew he'd just missed his chance, and sought to signal to bring some sort of order to his fleet, which was now spread over a wide area. Dreadful confusion resulted as the ships which had entered the harbor tried to turn around and escape back into the open sea. Some ships collided, and ships had oars sheared off by friendly vessels. Eventually, the Romans managed to form a rough line of ships close in the shore, with their rams facing out to the sea, the flagship now being on the extreme left of the Roman line. In the meantime, Adherbal had outflanked the left of the Roman line with 5 ships angled forward, and placed his own ship facing the Roman line. As the rest of the fleet came up, he ordered them to form a line on his vessel, subordinate officers regulating the deployment, presumably in smaller boats. After this delay, the two fleets formed up. Adherbal signaled his ships to attack. It would prove the only significant defeat suffered by the Roman navy throughout the war. 93 Roman ships were captured in the disaster. Many more were sunk. This was the only time when Carthage was able to use its skill advantage to bring about a decisive victory. The Romans were evidently no longer using the corvus, which had protected them from ramming. Plus, with their sterns firmly to the coast, the Romans just simply had no room to maneuver. Had the battle been fought on the open sea, things might have been different. But Claudius had gotten himself into a really difficult situation from which he was at a significant disadvantage from the word go. Carthage just had much more room to maneuver than the Roman ships did. The next year, Rome lost another 100-strong fleet to a storm. But this time was different, the storm, because it came after a defeat, not a victory, so things seemed a lot more serious. Rome could not afford to build yet another fleet and abandoned, for the moment, the war at sea. Rome had taken a lot of losses in this war so far. The census in 251 showed that there were 297,797 registered Roman male citizens. But in 247, 4 years later, that number had fallen to 200,041,712. That's a loss of over 50,000 men. But once again, Rome refused to give in. In 243, the Romans realized that if they were going to win the war, then they had no choice but to build another fleet. This one, however, 200 quinqueremes strong, would need to be financed by wealthy individuals who would be paid back after the war. The Senate, you see, was broke. One of the consuls for 242, Ullius Postumus Albinus, held the priesthood known as the Flamen Martellus and was forbidden by religious taboo from leaving the city. So the fleet was entrusted to the command of his colleague, Caius Lutellus Catullus, backed by the senior praetor. The Romans immediately renewed their pressure on the enemy's last major strongholds in Sicily, moving to capture, finally, the harbor at Drepana, and trying to cut off Lilybaeum from the sea. Hamilcar Barca, who is now the major commander on Sicily, was now cut off from resupply by the sea. Polybius tells us explicitly that the main Roman objective in these operations was to provoke a major encounter with the Carthaginian fleet, since they felt its defeat would be a greater blow than any successes might have achieved in Sicily. To this end, Catullus took a lot of care to exercise his ships at sea each day, training the crews to the highest level of efficiency that he could achieve. His sailors were never allowed to waste away in heavy labor, but were kept healthy and provided a good diet of food and drink. By 241, the Roman fleet was in superb condition, its crews experienced and skilled, its ships built to a far better design than in the past. The number of ships constructed in the preceding 20 years and the Romans' practical experience of naval operations only refined the skills of their shipwrights. The Carthaginians were far less well prepared for the upcoming encounter, for they had made little use of their naval superiority, which they achieved after Drepana and the Roman losses to weather. The Punic navy had done little in the years since then, and it appears that relatively few ships had actually even been kept in commission. It took them time to muster the crews for the fleet of 250 or so ships, which they ultimately gathered to send to Sicily. For probably the first and maybe only time in the war, the average Carthaginian crew was less well-trained than its Roman counterpart. It's also possible that many crews were under strength, although certainty is impossible. Their objective was twofold. In the first instance, the priority was to load the ships with supplies of grain for Hamilcar's army and the remaining Punic garrisons in Sicily. The Roman pressure on these troops made it difficult for them to survive by foraging. Once the supplies had been offloaded, the idea was that the fleet would then take on board the pick of Hamilcar's soldiers to serve as marines, and then seek out and destroy the Roman fleet. Command in this operation was given to another guy named Hanno, and we actually don't know. He might have been the same guy who had presided over the defeats at Agrigentum in 261 and in Comnus in 256. If so, bad choice. The Carthaginians followed the same route as the 50 ships, carrying reinforcements and supplies which Hannibal, son of Hamilcar, had sailed into Lilybaeum in 250. Crossing to the Aegates Islands, which are just to the west of Sicily, they stopped at the westernmost of these, which then was known as the Holy Island, and waited for a favorable breeze to carry them all the rest of the way. The Romans were not aware of their presence yet. However, Catullus received a report of their arrival and immediately took on board extra marines drawn from the army and crossed to another of the islands in this same Aegates group. That next day, this is now the 10th of March, 241, the wind blew strongly from the west in just the direction that Hanno had hoped for. The Punic ships raised their sails and begun to run in line to link up with their land forces. Catullus now had a tough choice to make. The heavy swell was really against the Romans. The rowers would have to battle hard against the wind if they were going to move and intercept the Punic fleet. In the past, Roman commanders who had treated the elements and storms in a cavalier manner had presided over the largest disasters of the war. However, if Catullus delayed, then he was unlikely to stop the Carthaginians joining Hamilcar and taking on board large numbers of experienced soldiers. Catullus took the risk and put to sea. This time, though, the Punic fleet stood little chance. It was overburdened with grain and had few marines. The Romans crashed straight into them, and by the end of the day, the Punic losses were 120 ships either lost or sunk. The Romans suffered losses as well. Actually, nearly 30 ships sank and another 50 were crippled. Luckily for Carthage, the wind picked up and allowed the remainder of the fleet to escape, but that counted for very little. The Battle of the Aegates Islands decided the war. Hamilcar Barca was now totally isolated in Sicily. Carthage made no effort to rebuild another fleet, and instead conceded defeat. The resources expended in the naval campaigns in the war have been massive. Polybius claiming that the Romans had lost about 700 warships and the Carthaginians near 500, although the accuracy of these figures has been doubted. The heaviest Roman losses all occurred in storms, and this ensured that the casualties suffered by the crews were disproportionately high. Many of the crews of the Punic ships were saved, although this sometimes meant going into captivity. It was the victors, ironically, who suffered the greatest losses at sea. Ultimately, the Romans won because of their ruthless determination, and the pursuit of victory made them willing to accept its high price in men and ships. The initial decision to create a Roman fleet may have at least been motivated in part by a desire to defend the Roman coast from the Punic navy. But the Romans used their naval power in a consistently aggressive manner. The support of the navy allowed the Roman land forces in Sicily to press on more successfully with the task of subduing Punic strongholds there. And of course, we can never forget the ingenuity of the Corvus, which really swung the naval theater in Rome's direction for those first crucial years, when we might have expected the Punic naval tradition to carry the day. Carthage, however, never displayed the aggressiveness that allowed the Romans to win. They had naval advantages in 264-263, and again briefly in 241, but they never used them. Punic commanders in Sicily only lost territory. They never even attempted to win any back. The Roman approach to the war was very different from what Carthage had encountered before, and it seemed not to know what to make of it. If you ask me, what won Rome the First Punic War came down to one word: attitude. Okay, fine, maybe two words: attitude and Corvus. After the disastrous defeat at the Aegates Islands, the Carthaginians gave Hamilcar Barca full authority to negotiate a peace with Rome. In fact, Hamilcar, eager to disassociate himself from any admission of defeat, acted through one of his subordinate officers, Gesgo. The consul Catullus' year of office had almost expired, and the desire to gain credit for completing such a major war before his successors arrived to steal the glory may have made him actually a little bit more conciliatory. An initial Roman demand that Hamilcar's Sicilian army should immediately surrender its weapons and hand over for punishment all Roman and Italian deserters was swiftly rejected. The mercenaries would leave the army with their arms and honor intact. Yet, this seems to have been the only concession that the Carthaginians were able to gain, and as we'll find out in a minute, it wasn't much of a concession. In other respects, the peace terms made it clear that they had been defeated and that Rome was not negotiating with an equal. Peace was declared between Rome and Carthage, provided that all the following conditions were met. A. The Carthaginians were to evacuate all of Sicily. B. Neither side was to make war on the other's allies, nor seek to subvert their allegiance by allying with them directly or becoming involved in their internal affairs. They were not to recruit soldiers or raise money for the construction of public buildings in the territory of the other. C. The Carthaginians were to give up all Roman prisoners freely while paying a ransom for their own. And finally, D. The Carthaginians were to pay an indemnity to the Roman state of 2,200 Euboean talents over a 20-year period. Now, Roman council did not have the authority to make a final peace treaty himself. The Roman people had to vote in their centuries to ratify any treaty. Thus, Catullus had to take these terms back to Rome. The Roman people in this case felt that the terms were too lenient. The indemnity was therefore increased from 2,200 to 3,200 talents, with the 1,000 increase payable immediately. The only other change was a minor clause requiring Carthage to evacuate all the small islands between Sicily and Africa. The Romans had clearly accomplished their war aim. Carthage was completely expelled from Sicily. Moreover, Carthaginian naval power had been broken. Yet, for the moment, Carthage had lost no territory in Spain or North Africa, and it even held on to Sardinia for a time. The Romans recognized that Carthage was different from the Samnites or any other Italian community they had subdued. They couldn't simply annex all of Carthage, not yet, at least. The war also brought an administrative change for Rome, its first province. Historians are not sure exactly when the change happened, But by 227 BCE, Western Sicily got its first Roman governor and became the first Roman province, as we understand the term today. With hindsight, it's honestly difficult to pinpoint any point during the war when the Carthaginians came close to victory. The most serious Roman losses were due to bad weather and not to enemy action. Perhaps in the earliest phases, if Carthage had been able to prevent the Roman expedition from crossing the Straits of Messina, or had defeated Claudius's army after it landed, then they might have dissuaded the Romans from further adventures in Sicily, or at least in the short term. But that, in fact, would have been to prevent the crisis from developing into a war in the first place, so that wouldn't count as winning the war. Yet it was extremely difficult for squadrons of galleys to block a stretch of water, and the Punic forces in Sicily in 264 were totally inadequate to achieve such a quick victory over a Roman consular army. Apart from the decision to continue the struggle and send a large army to Sicily after Rome's defeat of Syracuse, the Carthaginian war effort was basically passive. They were always reacting to Roman moves, all intended to protect their existing positions in Sicily, never expand them. Even when they sought to harass the enemy by raiding the Italian coast, the main objective was to draw Roman forces away from Sicily. On the island itself, their strategy followed the traditional Carthaginian pattern of enduring an enemy onslaught and trying to maintain and control over as many strongholds as possible, waiting for the enemy to weaken so that eventually the lost ground could be regained. Carthage had been involved in sporadic conflict in Sicily for centuries before the Romans arrived. And if Carthage had never gained full control of the island, neither had Carthage ever been completely expelled. The Romans were not like Pyrrhus, though, who would abandon his offensive when he failed to gain widespread support from the Greek communities of Sicily. Nor was their power as precarious as that of all the tyrants of Syracuse over the years. Roman persistence was at least the equal of Carthage's, but it was married to an extremely aggressive mode of war-making, applying continuous pressure on an enemy in an effort to force capitulation. Throughout the conflict, they consistently assumed the offensive, methodically expanding their territory, which they controlled in Sicily, continuing to do so even when their army's morale reached a low ebb after the defeat of Regulus. More importantly, they were willing to escalate the conflict in an effort to defeat the enemy, invading Africa, and most of all, deciding to create a fleet and pursue the war at sea in spite of their colossal losses. Rome's huge reserves of manpower made it possible to absorb appalling losses, but this in and of itself doesn't explain the willingness with which the population continued to be ready to serve in the war. Another change in Roman behavior during the war was the election of consuls based on ability and experience, rather than pure political connections. After Drepana in 249 BCE, there was a marked change in who was elected. In fact, after Drepana, the Romans appointed a military dictator to control the operations in Sicily for a period, the only time in the war that happened. Still, Rome continued its practice of appointing two consuls, by and large, and they still rotated command when in the field together. The only reason the weakness in this system was not more apparent during the First Punic War was because there weren't more pitched battles. But that is soon to change. True, Carthaginian commanders may have been more quote-unquote professional than their Roman counterparts, and certainly remained in their posts for much longer periods, but few would have had much experience of commanding such large forces as frequently employed during the war. This was totally true of the admirals appointed to the control of the operations of what were unprecedentedly large fleets, which were formed on several occasions. Their inexperience of command at this level added to the already major practical difficulties in coordinating the movements of hundreds of oared warships, and was perhaps another factor in denying the Carthaginian navy the advantages it ought to have derived from the superior skill of its crews. Several Punic generals were crucified in the aftermath of military failures during the war, usually, it seems, by order of their own immediate subordinates. Yet other defeated leaders escaped punishment and went on to hold further commands, which suggests that political influence, as much as actual responsibility, determined their fate. The Romans were considerably more lenient toward their magistrates who presided over disasters, awarding triumphs to successive admirals who had lost most of their fleets to bad weather. Only Claudius was prosecuted on the charge of what they called perdulio. In a sense, it meant sort of like bringing the state into disrepute. And that was for his behavior at Drepana. But he even narrowly escaped condemnation and was instead found guilty of a lesser charge and fined. After the war, Carthage faced another conflict that nearly saw the complete destruction of the city itself, the Mercenary War. This was 100% a self-inflicted wound. Normally, mercenaries were returned to Carthage by nationality, paid, and then sent back to their country of origin. But this time, Carthage decided that no one would be paid until all the mercenaries were present. A huge mistake. Compounding this mistake, Carthage decided that it would try to renegotiate the amount it owed to the very men who had risked their lives and served Carthage well for years. Yikes. As a result, and after numerous disturbances on the streets of Carthage, the mercenaries were sent to the town of Sica, where they encamped without a commander and with no duties to maintain their discipline. Understandably, the mercenaries who had fought loyally and well for their masters, and according to their contracts, were reluctant to accept any payment less than their due. They felt totally betrayed. They were especially bitter towards Hamilcar, who had made lavish promises of future rewards during the operations in Sicily, only to abandon them to the whims of a government and the generals they did not know. The Carthaginians soon realized the negotiations were not succeeding, and aware that they would have the difficulty in controlling 20,000 well-equipped veteran soldiers, agreed to pay the full amounts the men were due, but it was too late. The disgruntled mercenaries had become aware of their own strength, and they steadily increased their demands, forcing one concession after another out of Carthage. Resentment at their unfair treatment gradually turned into deep hostility toward the Carthaginians. Like all Punic armies, the veterans for Sicily were a mixture of many different peoples: Libyans, Gauls, Spaniards, Ligurians, Sicilian Greeks, runaway slaves, deserters from Rome. Lacking a common language and without a unifying force of a Carthaginian command structure, the mercenaries at Sica had fragmented into groups along ethnic lines. The Libyans were the largest of these, and it was they who finally turned mutiny into open revolt when they seized and imprisoned the unfortunate Gesgo, the man the mercenaries themselves had chosen to deal with as the only Punic officer that they trusted. It was the presence of this Libyan element within the army which was to make the rebellion so serious, because they were able to swiftly rally most of their countrymen to their cause. Carthaginian rule had always been harsh and unpopular for the Libyan peasantry, but during the war with Rome, the burdens of taxation and conscription had grown far worse. With very few exceptions, the Libyan communities declared for the rebels and swelled the size of their forces. They were joined by many of the Numidian princes, whom the Carthaginians had been fighting to control over the last decade, and who now saw an opportunity for revenge. Soon, an army many times the size of the one Regulus had led began a blockade of Carthage. The main rebel leaders were Mathos, a Libyan, and Spendius, an escaped Campanian slave, who feared being returned to his former master for execution. These were supported by a Gaul, Autoriatus, a chieftain of remarkably unreliable band of warriors in the war, if we were being fair. Some of his followers had actually deserted to the Romans during the war and later went on to betray them as well. Though veteran soldiers, Spendius had an especially distinguished record during the war with Rome, none of these men had experience of high command, and the movement of the rebel armies were clumsy and poorly coordinated. This was one of the few advantages the Carthaginians enjoyed in the conflict. It was always difficult for them to raise large armies quickly, but the situation worsened when their own mercenaries turned against them. In addition to the rebellion in Libya, this denied them access to revenue and resources of manpower on which they could normally rely. The forces which were able to raise, composed of some still loyal mercenaries who felt no particular bond with unfamiliar Sicilian veterans, and newly raised citizen soldiers, were heavily outnumbered. Further problems were caused by a divided command. similar to the appointment of 3 generals to lead the operations back in the Punic War in 256-255. Hamilcar Barca and Hanno, who was better organizer than commander, didn't get along with each other, and the operations of their armies were hindered by the sort of disputes which were normally actually more typical of the Romans. Hanno was later forced to resign by vote of the army, or probably just the senior officers, and replaced by a more amenable Hannibal, son of Hamilcar. It is in these campaigns, far more than in the war in Sicily, that we see evidence of Hamilcar's skill as a general, consistently outmaneuvering the larger rebel forces. He combined force with diplomacy. For instance, when Navaras, a Numidian prince, offered to defect with his followers, he was rewarded with a marriage to Hamilcar's daughter. Both sides made extensive and ever-escalating use of horror and atrocity, Hamilcar ordering captured mercenaries to be trampled to death by his elephants. Eventually, the 2 commanders, Mathos and Spendius, were both captured and crucified, while the unfortunate Gesgo and the other hostages were dismembered and tossed into a ditch where they bled to death. Eventually, by 237, the rebel armies had finally been defeated, and the Libyan community surrendered, and the mercenary revolt collapsed. Yet, in the end, the message is clear. Guys, just pay your mercenaries. Now, I mentioned that Carthage would hold on to Sardinia, but only for a time. In 240, Punic officers and their soldiers on the island mutinied. They called to Rome for aid, promising them land in Sardinia if they allied against Carthage. Somewhat surprisingly, Rome said no. It would abide by the treaty. But by 237, when the same thing happened again, the Romans lost their scruples and sent a force to take the island. Carthage objected, but it was in no position to do anything about it. So Rome got another province. That being said, I should mention, Sardinia proved a tough nut to crack, and Rome had to fight until 231 to subdue the resistance there. Sicily and Sardinia were lost, and in the aftermath of the mercenary rebellion, Africa was too unstable for further expansion to be contemplated. So Carthage turned its attention increasingly to Spain. In 238-237, Hamilcar Barca was sent at the head of an army to take charge of the province there. And the choice of such an experienced and aggressive commander for a region which does not appear to have faced a major threat can only mean that the objective was expand. For the next 9 years, Hamilcar fought almost continuously, securing Punic control of the coastal stirrup of southern Spain and pushing up the valley of Guadalquivir until he was killed in an ambush by a Celtic Tiberian tribe known as the Orentai in 229. One source actually claims that he deliberately sacrificed himself to save his sons. He was succeeded in his command by his son-in-law, and second in command at the time, Hasdrubal, who continued the program of expansion, achieving more through diplomacy than war, even marrying a Spanish princess to cement one alliance. The succession seems to have been voted for first by the army in Spain and subsequently approved back in Carthage. This was certainly the case when Hasdrubal himself was assassinated in 221, and the army, or at least its officers, gave the command then to Hamilcar's eldest son, Hannibal, a decision later ratified by the popular assembly in Carthage. So, the basic story of Punic expansion in Spain under the Barcid family is pretty straightforward, and it's not controversial at all, even if our sources sometimes contradict each other on minor points. Still, many important questions remain unanswered. It's unclear how and why Hamilcar was given Spanish command in the first place, and to what extent his activities, once there, were supervised. One extreme view is to see this period as a triumph of a sort of popular, maybe even populist, party in Carthage. Hamilcar, the demagogue, winning the support of ordinary citizens who were tired of the incompetence displayed by the old aristocracy during the First Punic War with Rome, and then, subsequently, in the mercenary rebellion. This allowed him to secure an unlimited command in Spain, with the freedom to wage war and enrich himself for his own purposes. There may be a few indications of political change at Carthage, since the Council of 104 seems far less important during this period, and the importance of 2 annually elected suephytes may have increased. However, it must always be remembered that any evidence that we have for this constitution and internal politics of Carthage is exceptionally poor and sometimes non-existent completely. Most of our sources do portray the Barcid family as facing strong opposition from rivals, who feared their growing power, and from those who objected to their policies, but it's unclear how strong and consistent such opposition was. In one tradition, Hamilcar used the booty from his Spanish campaigns both to secure the loyalty of his soldiers and to buy himself political support at home. It is equally possible to interpret the same evidence as showing Hamilcar as nothing more than a servant of the state, appointed with the general approval of the elite at Carthage. And frankly, my guess is the truth is somewhere in between. The Second Punic War really begins in Spain, making the activity of the Barcid family there in the years after the First War especially important. But our sources' awareness of this only makes it more difficult to understand what sort of regime they created. How significant was it? And why did it matter that command was always exclusively held by members of one family? It's not entirely clear whether the Carthaginians just ratified the army's choice of leader because they felt they were powerless to change this, or because that was always the plan. There may have been practical benefits from this, since it was far easier for the Spanish tribes and leaders to focus their loyalty on an individual general and on his family, rather than a distant Carthage, a concept. And these are emotions which the Romans would later exploit. The activities of the Barcids in Spain may simply be seen as an effective way for the Carthaginian state to expand its territory there, allowing them more easily to exploit the resources of both mineral wealth and military manpower. For other historians, these years saw the creation of what was, in effect, a semi-independent principality ruled by the Barcid family for their own ends. Our evidence, however, is utterly inadequate to resolve this debate. The same series of coins produced in Punic Spain in this period have been interpreted as showing Hamilcar and Hasdrubal depicted as Hellenistic kings, even with divine associations. Hasdrubal, definitely, we know, founded a major city called New Carthage, which is modern Cartagena. But whether this should be seen as a seat of provincial government or a capital of a semi-independent kingdom depends on the view that you take of the Barcids themselves. The Romans certainly kept a weary eye on the Carthaginian activity in Spain, although as of yet there was no direct involvement from Rome in the area. In 231, a delegation of senators went to Hamilcar to ask him about the motives for his aggressive campaigns, and was told that these were necessary if Carthage was to pay that massive indemnity that it owed to Rome. Later, sometime around 226, another set of envoys went to Hasdrubal, who formally agreed not to expand beyond the river Ebro, and this is, of course, going to be the spark later that's going to start off the Second Punic War. It's possible that Rome's interest in Spain was encouraged by her longtime ally, Messia, that's modern-day Marseille in Spain, or in France, but the concern over growing Carthaginian power may well have been genuine. As yet, Rome had no direct connection at all, that's to be clear, with the Spanish peninsula. Latin traders were certainly active there, but they didn't have any government influence. In fact, between 241 and 218, Rome found itself mostly occupied around the Po River in modern northern Italy. This is the region around Milan, but referred to in our Roman sources as Cisalpine Gaul. It took the Romans until 218 to finally subdue the people there and continue what had turned into a lengthy process of colonization. Spain and northern Italy would see much activity when the war was finally renewed between Rome and Carthage. In addition, many of the individuals on both sides were prominent in the campaigns in the 220s and would later play a significant role in the war with Hannibal. For a generation of Roman commanders who grew up between the wars with Carthage, the First and Second Punic War, their military experience was in Sardinia, Illyria, and as I mentioned, most of all, Cisalpine Gaul. And they got accustomed to warfare against armies, which were technically unsophisticated, though the individual soldiers were skilled and, very brave. It was, though, poor preparation for confronting a general as skilled as Hannibal at the head of a well-trained army. Next time, discuss the beginnings of the Second Punic War.